Hello, friends. It is an Eis Tzara for our community, as in addition to other needs and concerns that we daven for, we are praying with urgency for Refuah Shalema B'Mehera, for Yossi Rosner, Yosef Simcha Chaim Ben Sarah Chana, a former Talmud of our Masifta, and a young man from our community who's very much in need of our tefillos now, and may our tefillos be answered. And so many people are saying Tehillim constantly, engaging in initiatives of tefillah b'kavana, being more flexible and taking on things bein adam lachavero, and I'm sure there are many initiatives that I'm not even aware of, and it really is a community gathering in serious tefillah and introspection. In that regard, I'd like to begin with a personal account. I want to share something that happened to me a few months ago, which I have not shared with anyone, privately or publicly, but it was something meaningful and important to me. I was in Eretz Yisrael back in November, and on the Sunday of my trip, I found myself davening at the wall, at the kotel, and a certain pasuk was jumping out at me and really reverberating in my mind over and over that day and thereafter. And let me explain why. Let me give a little bit of context. That was a very harrowing day. Unfortunately, as I was on my way into the old city, I actually took a cab. There was a terror attack. There was a pigua, as many of you may remember. Unfortunately, sadly, a young man, Eliyahu David K, I think was his name, lost his life in a terrible attack. And it was happening literally as I was on my way in. We couldn't figure out why we couldn't get into the old city. My cab driver called a friend of his who informed him what had happened, and we ended up making a sibuv and not going in at that time. And we put on the news, and we were very distracted. In the midst of the commotion, the driver must have asked me exactly where I needed to go. So the first yeshiva I was visiting was going to Yeshiva Oraita, so it's on a street called Miskav Ladach in the old city. So I must have said the name of the street, and I wasn't really paying attention. I wouldn't have told him to drive me to that street. You can't drive to it anyway, and at that point in time you couldn't get into the old city. But he heard me, and before I knew it, and when I wasn't really paying attention, I was listening to the news, I discovered he had actually driven somewhat away from the old city. We were in Katamon, and before I knew it, he was letting me off, or about to let me off. We were in front of a hospital. If I'm not mistaken, Miskav Ladach Street in the old city is so named because there used to be a Miskav Ladach hospital in the old city, which has now moved out of the old city. It's a very old hospital in Israel, predates the Medina by many years. So then I corrected him. No, I didn't need the hospital. I needed to get to that street in the old city. He took me back. It took a while, and eventually, after things settled down, I got into the old city. And as soon as I had a break in the action from the yeshivas I was visiting, I actually had been informed of another person who needed tefillos. So I had made up my mind I was going to go to the kosel, to the wall, and daven. Earlier in the day, I had started from the beginning of Tehillim, and I found myself davening at the kosel, which was emotional for me. It was my first time there in 2 years, and I always make a point of going there and focusing. And I was reciting Tehillim, and I may have started at Perek Zayin or Ches. Before I know it, I was reciting Perek Tes and Tehillim, and there you have the pasuk, V'yehi Hashem Miskav Ladach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Miskav Ladach. That's where the name of that hospital and the term that street comes from. And it sort of jumped out at me in a day when there were such harrowing circumstances. The Jewish people are the victims of the hatred of our enemies. And here, this pasuk, which was the street I was going to, which was the hospital I ended up in, now I'm reciting this pasuk in Tehillim, which means HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the stronghold, the fortress, that which is Miskav, it's untouchable, Ladach, for the person who is Daka Ushval Ruach, for the person who is oppressed, for the person who is crushed. And the end of the pasuk is V'yehi Hashem V'yeshem mizgav ladach, mizgav le'itim batzara, or le'itos batzara. HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only is a stronghold for the single person who is in a state of dako shval ruach, but le'itos batzara, when collectively it's a hard time, when Am Yisrael experiences, or when a community, when a group of people feel that it is an es tzara, then he is a miskav for all of us, not just for one person that his tefillah will be answered, but when Am Yisrael comes together and feels the es tzara, so he's the repository and is responsive to the tefillos of all of Am Yisrael and becomes a miskav for all of us as we come together and recognize that this is an es tzara, not for one person, not for one family, but for the community. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should in fact be a miskav for us, a fortress, a source of strength. The tefillos and all of the zechuyos should come before the kisei hakavod, and they should be granted, and we should be granted a response to those tefillos and see a refuah shlema for Yossi, and see all of our tefillos answered. At the same time as we engage in tefillah, we are also looking for what kabbalos, what things can we take on as a merit for a refuah shlema. And I think here we look to the parsha. It's important. People are always looking for things that will be lasting, that will be impactful. This week we read of the Aseres HaDibros, Maimed Har Sinai. Nothing was more impactful, more transformative for Am Yisrael than the experience at Har Sinai. But it was not a one-time experience. The Gemara in the third parak of Maseches Brachos says, the pasuk says, "V'hodatem levanecha v'levnei vanecha," which can be referring to teaching Torah to your children and your grandchildren. Next pasuk, Yom Asher Amadata B'Har Sinai, the day you stood at Sinai. Says the Gemara, just as at Har Sinai, we will read the pasuk, Vayar ha'am vayanu, the people saw and they quivered, they trembled, they shook. Just as there it was with a state of trepidation and awe and fear, so too every time you learn Torah. V'hodatem levanecha v'levnei vanecha should be be'ema, be'yira, be'reses, v'ziyah. Has to be with a sense of awe, with fear, a transformative experience. I think every person who lives an inspired and committed life of Torah can trace back to some inspiring and transformative experience. For people who had the zchus to spend time in yeshiva, it's a Rosh Yeshiva, a mashgiach, a shir they attended, a way of thinking, an experience in Torah that broadened and deepened and made them realize just how vast the Torah is. In my own lifetime, the greatest European gadol who I had as chus to know was Rav Zelig Epstein, Zachron Levracha. I remember one time, a little over 20 years ago, he was giving a shir on a difficult Rambam and Hilchos Talmud Torah, and the Achronim grapple with a question, and he laid it out and showed that this is not the way to understand it, this is the way to understand it, and then this works out better, and that works out better, and he put all the pieces together with unbelievable brilliance, and it was a reflection of the great godless Torah of the great European yeshivas. I remember I walked out of the shir, and I encountered one of the high school rabbeim. This would have been a shir for the Beis Medrash boys, and he said, "How was the shir today?" And I said, "It was Maimed Har Sinai." And he was a little taken aback by my description, but I remember feeling it was Maimed Har Sinai, seeing the greatness in Torah that exists in our own world, in our own lives, can be an experience, a re-experiencing of Maimed Har Sinai. My newborn grandson is named for my wife's grandfather, Rav Shach Nazon. He's named Shalom for Rav Shalom Shach Nazon. Rav Shach Nazon was a person who, even though his family emigrated to the United States when he was a young boy, went back to Europe to study, even though those were difficult times. He went back to Europe to study in the Mir, in Kamenetz, under the great Rosh Yeshiva and Gedolim, and he was so taken by them, so much so that at one point when his mother was sick and he had to travel back to America, he made a point of stopping off to visit the Chavetz Chaim. He spent a total of 4 days with the Chavetz Chaim, but he is incorrectly referred to by people as the Talmud of the Chavetz Chaim. This was a recurring phenomenon we discovered in the family, that people were always talking about him as a Talmud, a student of the Chavetz Chaim, because the 4 days he spent with the Chavetz Chaim made such an impression on him that he spoke about them for his whole life. That's why Yar Ha'am Bayanu, that is experiencing Maimed Har Sinai in your own life, in your own exposures and the people you have to study under. People who came to Judaism later in life have that moment, that experience, that made them see the truth of it and the greatness of it. Many years ago, I walked into a Svarim store here in Philadelphia, and I was looking to buy a Baal HaTurim on Chumash, and the man behind the counter, and maybe some people watching this video know him and remember him, but Yossi Mizrahi said to me, the Baal HaTurim made me from. He was at a shir, and he was heard the gematria when the brothers of Yosef come down to Mitzrayim after that whole long, complicated story, unbelievable story, and it says Vayishtachavu lo, and they bowed to him. The Baal HaTurim says the gematria of Vayishtachavu lo is Bekan Niskayim Hachalom. Here the dream was fulfilled, and he heard that. He said it just something clicked. The beauty of the Torah, the truth of the Torah, the profundity of the Torah. He said, for me, that Baal HaTurim, that was that moment for him, that Har Sinai moment. When we Rebbeim at the Mesivta talk to our Talmidim about what their plans should be, what their aspirations should be after they graduate, after they complete their years of yeshiva high school, and we emphasize the importance and the greatness of studying full-time for at least a year or two or several years, full-time yeshiva learning after high school in Eretz Yisrael or elsewhere. And sometimes people don't understand why is that so important. But the answer is because there are some things that are just Har Sinai-like experiences. They're transformative. They shape your whole life thereafter. It's axiomatic to Judaism that we are supposed to remember Har Sinai. The Torah commands us to do so. And just as Har Sinai changed the Jewish people forever, so too, just as the Torah was given, and the Jews were in a state of be'ema, be'yira, be'reses ubeziyah, a state of trepidation, a state of awe, a transformative experience, so too we are supposed to seek out in our own lives Torah experiences, Torah influences that are transformative, as we seek now to be marbe b'zchuyos, to seek opportunities for added zechusim. Let us look for things that are transformative, that will change us, that will be lasting, and let the merit of the echo of Har Sinai in our own time, in our own lives, serve as a schus for us, and especially for Yosef Simcha Chaim ben Sarah Chana l'Refuah Shalema b'Mehera b'Soch Sha'ar Chole Yisrael.